On September the 4th, 1957, nearly 3 million Americans walked into car dealerships to witness the future. Ford Motor Company had spent 2 years and $250 million telling them something revolutionary was coming. The advertising never showed the car, just shadows, silhouettes, the promise of an entirely new kind of car. They called it E-Day. By December, monthly sales had collapsed by 2/3. 26 months later, Ford quietly discontinued the brand. Total loss, $350 million. In today's money, that's over $2.9 billion. The car was named after the boss's dead son. The family had begged them not to do it. To understand the crash, you need to understand the road that led there. The archive opens in 1943. Edsel Ford, the only son of Henry Ford, dies of stomach cancer at 49. He had been president of Ford Motor Company since 1919, though his father never truly let him lead. By most accounts, Edsel was a gentleman, a gifted designer, the creative force behind the Lincoln Continental and the Mercury line. His father bullied him relentlessly. His grandson Henry Ford II would later say, "That old man killed my father." When Edsel died, the company named nothing after him. His legacy was the designs he'd championed over his father's objections. That was enough. 12 years later, in 1955, Ford's executives saw a problem. General Motors dominated the medium-priced car market with Pontiac, Oldsmobile, and Buick. Chrysler had Dodge and DeSoto. Ford had only Mercury. The company was losing customers as they moved up the economic ladder. A Ford buyer who prospered would buy a Pontiac or Buick, not another Ford. Ford's solution: create an entirely new division to capture the middle market, a new brand, a new dealer network, a new car designed from the ground up for the upwardly mobile American family. The project was codenamed the E-Car. The E stood for experimental. Ford hired the advertising firm Foote, Cone & Belding to develop a name. The agency returned with 6,000 possibilities. Ford's executive vice president Ernest Breech was unimpressed. "We hired you to come up with one name," he said, "not 6,000. In desperation, Ford's marketing department asked Marianne Moore, a Pulitzer Prize-winning poet, for suggestions. Moore submitted over 24 names, each more delightfully impractical than the last: Resilient Bullet, Mongoose Civique, Andante con Moto. Her final suggestion: Utopian Turtle Top. Ford thanked Moore with 24 roses and a note addressed to their favorite turtle topper. Then they ignored everything she'd written. In November 1956, with time running out, the executive committee met without Henry Ford II present. Ernest Breech grew impatient. "Why don't we just call it Edsel?" he asked. The Ford family was horrified. Henry II had already declared he didn't want his father's good name spinning around on thousands of hubcaps. Edsel Ford's 3 sons all opposed the choice. Edsel's widow Eleanor reportedly slammed the door on the executive who delivered the news. The company's public relations director typed a terse memo. "We have just lost 200,000 sales." They named it Edsel anyway. The name was just the beginning of the problems. Ford wanted the Edsel to be a separate division, but they never gave it a separate factory. Edsels rolled off the same assembly lines as Fords and Mercurys. Before the Edsel, Ford plants produced roughly 60 cars per hour. The Edsel became car 61. Workers had to switch tools, change parts bins, and interrupt their rhythm every few minutes to build something completely different. Ford had made a calculation. Edsel production should not reduce Ford or Mercury output. This meant less time per vehicle. It meant workers who resented building someone else's car. It meant quality that was, in the words of one historian, a lucky dip. Cars arrived at dealerships with notes attached to the steering wheels listing the parts that hadn't been installed. Trunk lids popped open when drivers shifted into reverse. Oil leaks were common. The push-button transmission in the steering wheel, marketed as the revolutionary Teletouch drive, frequently malfunctioned. Dealers, many of whom were new to the car business after signing up for Edsel exclusive franchises, had no training on how to fix the problems. The design was meant to be revolutionary. what emerged was something else. Chief designer Roy Brown had envisioned a sleek vertical grille, slender and elegant. Engineers insisted on enlarging it for better cooling. Executives demanded further modifications. The result was a vertical chrome oval that dominated the front of the car. Critics called it a horse collar. Others said that it looked like an Oldsmobile sucking a lemon. The less charitable comparisons were anatomical. Time magazine described it as a midwife's view of labor and delivery. But the real disaster was timing. When Ford approved the Edsel in 1955, the medium-priced car market was booming. Americans bought over 7 million new cars, a record. The economy was flush. Bigger was better. More chrome, more power, more status. By September 1957, the world had changed. A recession was beginning. Consumer spending was tightening. Gas prices were rising. Americans were suddenly interested in something Ford's market research had completely overlooked: small, economical cars. Volkswagen Beetle sales exceeded 50,000 units that year. American Motors' compact Rambler was surging while every medium-priced brand was collapsing. E-Day was September 4th, 1957. Teaser ads ran for months, showing the car wrapped or blurred, promising the car of the future. Dealers were forbidden to show the vehicles before the official date. Even dealers themselves hadn't seen what they were selling. The public had been teased into expecting, as one writer put it, a plutonium-powered, pancake-making supercar. What they saw on E-Day was a Ford with different trim. Nearly 3 million people visited showrooms that first weekend. They looked. They didn't buy. The car they'd been promised was revolutionary. What sat on the showroom floor was recognizably a Ford or Mercury with a strange grille and push-button transmission. The prices were wrong too. The cheapest Edsel cost only $74 less than the most expensive Ford. Many potential buyers simply chose the established brand. Ford had anticipated selling 200,000 Edsels in the first year. They sold 63,000. By November, production had dropped from almost 20,000 units per month to barely 2,000. On November 19, 1959, Ford announced the end of the Edsel program. Just 118,000 had been built across 3 model years. The final year produced fewer than 3,000 units before the line went silent forever. The executive who killed it was Robert McNamara, the same man who would soon become Secretary of Defense under President Kennedy. McNamara had opposed the Edsel from the beginning. He was already developing something else, a small, economical compact car that would compete with the imports Americans actually wanted. That car was the Ford Falcon. It debuted in October 1959, 1 month before the Edsel's death. In its first year, the Falcon sold over 435,000 units, becoming the most successful new car launch in American history at that time. 5 years later, a derivative of the Falcon platform would become the Ford Mustang. McNamara's bet on what Americans actually wanted paid off. The Edsel's bet on what Ford executives thought Americans should want did not. The contrast tells the whole story. While Ford was spending $250 million convincing Americans to buy bigger, flashier, medium-priced cars, Americans were buying Volkswagens and waiting for Detroit to offer something smaller. The Edsel wasn't alone in its suffering. The recession devastated the entire medium-priced sedan segment. DeSoto sales plunged 54%. Mercury dropped 48%. Buick lost a third of its customers, but these were established brands with loyal buyers who would return when the economy recovered. The Edsel had no such cushion. It was asking Americans to take a chance on an unproven car from an unproven division at exactly the moment when Americans were least willing to take chances. Ford attempted a rescue. They sponsored the Edsel Show on CBS, a television special featuring Bing Crosby, Frank Sinatra, Louis Armstrong, and Rosemary Clooney. The ratings were enormous. The sales were not. They trimmed the product line for 1959, toned down the controversial grille, added an optional 6-cylinder engine. Sales dropped another 29%. When Toyota introduced its first car to America on October 31st, 1957, less than 2 months after E-Day, they offered something the Edsel could never be: small, economical, and affordable. The future of the American auto market was arriving from Japan while Ford was busy naming cars after dead relatives. 3 mistakes that turned market research into a monument to failure. First, Ford mistook data for insight. They surveyed thousands of Americans about what they wanted in a car. They hired psychologists to study the personality of car buyers. They generated 6,000 possible names and consulted Pulitzer Prize-winning poets. They analyzed every detail except the most important one, whether the market they were targeting would still exist when the car was ready. Market research told them what buyers wanted in 1955. It couldn't tell them what buyers would want in 1958. By the time the Edsel arrived, America had changed its mind. Consider what Ford's competitors did. When American Motors saw the market shifting towards smaller cars, they abandoned their medium-priced Nash and Hudson brands and focused on the compact Rambler. Sales soared. George Romney, president of American Motors, had publicly predicted the medium-priced market's collapse before the Edsel even launched. Ford didn't listen. Second, they ignored the people who knew the product best. The Ford family opposed naming the car Edsel. The public relations director predicted they'd lose 200,000 sales over the name alone. Robert McNamara argued against the entire project. Assembly line workers had no incentive to build quality into a car that wasn't really theirs. At every level, the people closest to the decision were overruled by executives who had already committed to their vision. Third, they believed their own marketing. Ford spent 2 years telling America the Edsel would be revolutionary. They convinced themselves it was true. When nearly 3 million people showed up on E-Day and walked away disappointed, Ford blamed the recession, the styling, the name, everything except the fundamental problem. They had promised a car of the future and delivered a car of the past. The hype became the enemy. If Ford had marketed the Edsel as simply a good mid-priced car with some interesting features, expectations might have been manageable. Instead, they promised a revolution and delivered a horse-collar grille. The Edsel lost $350 million in 1957. Adjusted for inflation, that's over $2.9 billion today. Ford's stock price dropped from above $60 to below $40. Earnings per share collapsed from $5.40 to $2.12. Over 1,000 Edsel exclusive dealerships closed or converted to other brands, and the name Edsel, which the family had begged Ford not to use, became a synonym for failure. Edsel Ford's 3 sons lived to see their father's name become a punchline. In word association tests, people responded to the word Edsel with pretzel and weasel. The poet Marianne Moore outlived the brand. She never got to drive a utopian turtle top. There's a final irony worth noting. Edsel Ford himself was a visionary who championed designs his father rejected. He created the Mercury division. He pushed for the Lincoln Continental. He fought for modern styling when Henry Ford wanted to keep building the Model T forever. If anyone at Ford understood that markets change and companies must change with them, it was Edsel Ford. The car that bore his name represented everything he would have opposed. Design by committee, marketing over substance, institutional arrogance over market reality. They dishonored his memory twice, first by ignoring his family's wishes, then by creating exactly the kind of corporate disaster he had spent his career trying to prevent. Today, fewer than 6,000 Edsels survive. Each one is a collector's item, worth far more than Ford ever imagined. The cars that symbolized failure in 1958 have become cherished artifacts, physical proof that even the largest corporations can convince themselves the future will look exactly like the past. The 3 million people who visited showrooms on E-Day knew immediately what Ford's executives couldn't see. The car of the future wasn't bigger and flashier. It was smaller, cheaper, and probably had a Japanese name. $2.9 billion. That's what it costs to learn that market research can't predict the future, that family objections sometimes matter, that when you promise a revolution, you'd better deliver one, and that naming a car after the boss's dead son over the explicit objections of his widow and children might not be the path to lasting success. Subscribe to Key R Crash Capitalism. Every like helps document what boardrooms hope stays buried.